So we've just finished getting the bounding box from the map. So we know the southwest corner and the northeast corner. And from that, we can query and find all of the houses within those two sets of coordinates. So we're going to go to the back end, build our GraphQL query, go to the front end and actually use that GraphQL query so that we can display houses both on the map and in the list, which will actually come in the next video. So right now we're just trying to load the data from the back end within the bounding box. So the first thing we're going to do, I already have it open, but we're going to go into where the house resolver lives. So that's in src schema house.ts. And the first thing we're going to do is scroll to the point where you find the coordinates input. We're going to go below here and we're just going to create a new input for querying the homes. And we're going to create an input called the bounds input. And this will allow us to basically pass up data in the right format to find houses within a bounding box. So we're going to say it's the class bounds input, like this. And just before I get too far, I will wrap it in an input type decorator. And then we'll just declare the fields that it has. So the first field it has is actually a coordinates input. So it's going to be a latitude and a longitude. So we're reusing a lot of the functionality we've built previously. And then this one will be the southwest corner. And its TypeScript type will also be coordinates input. And now we just have one more field for the northeast corner. So type coordinates input, northeast, exclamation mark, coordinates input. Cool. So this is what we need from the client, telling us what's the southwest corner, what's the northeast corner, so we can ask the database, hey, find me the houses constrained within those bounds. So with this bounds input set up, we're going to scroll all the way down into our resolver, and we're going to put it right here. Now you could put it anywhere, the order doesn't matter, but we've got our query to find a single house. Now we're going to put our query here to find an array of houses, the multi-house query. So this won't be house, but houses. So the first thing we want is to decorate. So we've got our query. It's going to return something, and what it's going to return is an array of houses like this. So this one, nullable. It's actually false. So you may not have any houses within the bounding box you set up, but it's still going to return an empty array, which is different than null. So nullable is false because at a minimum there will be an empty array. So we're going to define an async function called houses, and it's going to take in an argument, arg, like this, and that argument is going to be the bounds. So the variable name will be bounds, and the type for this in TypeScript will be the bounds input. We also need the context, so let's decorate this context variable, which is type of context, so that we can get Prisma and query the database from that. And now we just have to run the actual query itself. So we're going to be returning the result of it, and we'll access context.prisma.house.findMany, and we have to pass in our where clauses, telling the database how to restrict or constrain the houses that it's returning. And it will actually end up looking very similar to when we were finding the nearby houses, where we were sort of saying it's greater than and equal to the latitudes and longitudes, but we'll just type it out again ourselves. So in find many here, we're going to have a where clause, and we're going to say where the latitude is greater than or equal to. So now we'll access the bounds, the southwest corner, so the bottom left, and then the latitude, and it will be less than or equal to the top right corner, so that would be the bounds.northeast.latitude, and now we do the same for longitude. So it's greater than or equal to the southwest longitude and less than or equal to the northeast longitude, like that. So the problem with this right now, if we were to leave it, it could return billions of homes, billions, because what if they zoomed out the whole way and we weren't mapping homes, we were mapping humans? It's a little bit creepy, but okay, so we're just going to limit this. We're going to say take 50. So limit your results to 50 homes. Let's not get too crazy. So we'll save this and we're going to go to the browser. So I'm actually just going to refresh this playground here. Not because I'm going to do anything with it, but just by refreshing this playground, it will sort of run type GraphQL through its paces, which will update our schema.gql file. So in here, we now have the latest inputs, and it's added in this new houses query here that wants the bounds input. That was needed because we're going to run the code gen once we write our query on the front end, and we want it to have the up-to-date schema. So that's where we're moving now. We are moving into pages, index, the home page, and we are going to come up here and we can put it, it doesn't matter really where, we can put it above this type here, but we are going to need use query in GQL, so you'll have to uncomment that, and we'll say const houses query is equal to GQL, and we're going to write our query, so we'll call this the houses query, and it takes in a variable called bounds, and the type of data will be the bounds input for this. So the query itself, not just the name of it, is houses. It needs bounds, which will get its value from the bounds variable. And it's going to give us from each house that it returns the ID of the house, the latitude, the longitude, the address, the public ID used for displaying the image, and the number of bedrooms. Because this is all of the data we're going to be displaying on the home page. So we don't need to ask for stuff like the user ID, for example, because it's not important here. Cool, just like that. So we're going to come down and start to use this query. So we will put this, let's just say here. So we're going to say const, and it's going to give us some data and possibly an error if it couldn't query things correctly. And that's equal to use query. And the query we'll be using is this houses query, like this. So we need to pass in some variables. So we pass an object here, variables, and we need to get the variables right. So what do we need to pass in? We need to pass in bounds, like this. So you may say, okay, we're going to just use this debounced data bounds, but the problem is the format of this debounced data bounds, it's a string that contains an array of tuples with the coordinates in each one. We did a string both because we were saving it to local storage, but also because debounce does a shallow compare. So if you're comparing arrays and objects, sometimes the contents of those arrays and objects is the same, but because it's just saying whether they're equals, on a shallow compare sometimes it will say false, and that's why I thought it would be better to just use it in a string. So we have to parse this and put it in the right format. So we're going to create a function called parse bounds that's going to take in these debounced data bounds and then return things back in the correct format. So let's go create this function right here. We'll say const parse bounds, and that's equal to the bounds string that's being passed up to us. So bounds string of type string, like this. And we don't have to tell it the return type because TypeScript will be smart enough to figure it out on its own. So first we need to basically take this bounds string and convert it into something that looks like this type of data here. So we're going to say const bounds is equal to json.parse. We're going to parse the bounds string, and it will give us a bounds array, like this. And now we need to return, and we need to return it in the format that our input was expecting us to pass it in. So if you remember what that looked like, it was southwest coordinates, northeast coordinates. So we need to say southwest latitude, and the southwest latitude comes from 0, 1. the southwest longitude comes from 0, 0. So this tells us that when the map was giving us the bounds, it put longitude, then latitude. So in the other order than we've been doing it in. Cool. So now we've got the northeast like this. And what did I do? I messed up something. There we go. Okay. So the northeast latitude would be the bounds 1 at 1. And the longitude would be bounds at 1, 0. Cool. So now we know what type we're getting back. TypeScript was able to figure this out. And it's in the correct format that matches the bounds input. So we haven't given it any TypeScript types here yet. So we're just going to run the codegen command so that we can get those pumping. So we'll go to our console, run yard codegen, which looks at our GraphQL query, compares it with the schema, and generates the types for that. So once that's finished, we can see here we have these new types we can choose from. These were generated like this. And we'll go up to the top, make sure that we've imported them, and we can actually just copy and paste these. So house query and house query variables. We can go down to our use query within the component, and within our angly brackets, just paste those in. So it's told us that the variables we're sending are in the correct format, which is great, and now we know the type of data we're going to be getting back. So the first thing I want to do sort of below the query but before the layout is just check if I have an error. Like, what if something messed up? So why don't we say if there's an error, we're going to return a layout. And we have to give it a main, and we'll just say a div error loading houses. Like this. So at this point we should have the data if there's no error. And but I want to just, because we're not displaying it on the map quite yet, what I want to do is just console.log so we can see what's happening. So we're going to console.log the data being passed back to us. So go to the home page. I'm going to open up the developer tools console. Wait for this to load. Cool. So here we go. We have some houses. We have 3 of them. So we have the one, because we're looking at Toronto, we're finding the 3 homes in Toronto that we have, ID 4, 5, and 6, and it's working. So it's passing up the bounds that we could see if we popped over here to our GraphQL query. So here are the variables being passed up, our southwest and our northeast bounds, and then it's querying the database for that. If we wanted to see that in action, we could look here, and this is the yarn dev output, and we can see that it's actually writing an SQL query where it's finding within the bounds. So things seem to be working. But I wanted to show an issue that I noticed, and then we'll work on a solution for that. So let's say I zoom out a bit. See, it's as I zoom out, it's re-rendering, undefined for a sec, and then the houses again. So zoom in again, houses, we're all good, undefined, and then that. Even if I move it a little bit, see how we're always getting that undefined? And what that is basically Apollo has given us data. As it's rerunning the new query, as that new query is loading, even though we eventually get the same result back from Apollo, while it's in the loading state, it doesn't give us access to the previous data. It gives us an undefined. And that's not a huge deal, except you're going to get this annoying like flashing on the map as it's for a second undefined and then it pops back in. Even though you show the same data in the end, it's flashing on the screen. And that's sort of annoying. So what we're going to do is we're going to build another custom hook that's going to be very simple, but it's basically going to say, use the last data that had a value, and as soon as you get a new value, replace it. So just never allow an undefined state. I always want some data in there. So for that, we're going to go into src utils use last data. We're going to be using the useRef hook from React, and we're just going to export a function called useLastData. Now, this will take a generic in TypeScript to tell it what the type of data is that it will be receiving, as specified by the user who's calling it. And what it's going to do first is declare a ref. So a ref is like a mutable piece of data. It's a place to store, in a sense, state, but it's not state that would cause re-renders to happen. It's basically just data you want to store somewhere, but not have it affect re-rendering. So what we're going to do is, when data is passed into this hook, we're going to say, if it's not null and it's not undefined, that means it has a value, we're going to replace the current value in our reference with the data. And then we're always going to be returning the current data from our ref. So what this means, if we go back to our console here, it would store the houses. It receives undefined, so it's not going to override the ref.current until it comes down here and it has new houses to replace that value with. So we'll end up by getting rid of this undefined value here. So we'll save that. We'll go back to our home page, and now it's time to just use this hook, this custom hook. So we have to make sure it's imported. So import use last data, and then we can come here and before the if statement, so you can't have hooks and if statements mixed together. So we're going to say, we're going to call it last data, and we're going to say use last data. We're going to give you the data, and then we're going to get back last data. And now if we just look at last data instead of data, so we come here, let's clear out our console. So I zoom in, zoom out, move the map left and right. See, we don't have that undefined anymore. We basically used a ref to always keep track of the last data that is defined, that has a value, which is beautiful because we're no longer going to have a flicker. So that's all I wanted to cover in this video, because in the next video we're going to start passing the data to our map and displaying it on our map. So we won't cover that in this video. We'll basically just remove our console.log. We've got this last data, and we're going to be passing it to the map in the next video. So that's it. Take a pause. It's sort of incomplete, but we're going to get to displaying it in a second. See you then.